Hi, I'm Govindh, and this is Paper Napkin Wisdom. Today, is one of those conversations that invites you to slow down, look deeper, and maybe even notice something you've been avoiding. Because when you think about it, there's a moment in every leader's journey where doing more stops working and doing better starts to matter. Our guest this week gives us that insight and right at that intersection. Noah Ellis wrote three deceptively simple words on his napkin. And depending upon where you are on your journey, that might mean something slightly different to you than it will mean to somebody else. Maybe it's an idea you've been postponing. Maybe it's an uncomfortable conversation. Maybe it's the discipline of showing up where the real work actually happens. Or maybe it's just giving your full presence to the people you serve. What becomes possible when you stop spreading yourself thin and start doing fewer things better? Noah has built an entire philosophy, an entire hospitality brand around that question. From watching guests' body language to understanding the difference between a bad idea and bad execution, he's learned that excellence isn't theoretical, it's experimental. And you have to be there to understand it. You have to do the thing to create it. So, as you listen today, you may discover insights that you didn't expect. You might find yourself rethinking how to define value or how you evaluate what's working, or even how you show up for the people who rely on you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll walk away ready to do the thing that's been waiting for you. Let's dive into my conversation with Noah Ellis. Noah Ellis, welcome to Paper Napkin Wisdom. Excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you shared a really long napkin with lots of words crammed onto the napkin. I love it when napkins show up like this. It has three words on it, and it says "Do the thing,"
And some
underlined,
punctuation.
bold
And some
print.
punctuation.
Yeah, and a big period at the end. What? Why did you share that with me?
So something I've kind of realized in life, but it's taken me longer to put together than I'd like to admit, is um, kind of everything that you want is on the other side of something you want to do, or you don't want to do rather. So for me, and I think it can get interpreted a lot of different ways, but I really look at it as maybe not compromise, but some sort of dichotomy. So it's not, I think some people who know me and people who sort of see it always think like, and especially these days with the notion of this like hustle culture and grind culture, it means just work harder and do more. And I don't necessarily think that's the case, although those aren't bad attributes to have. I think for me, do the thing is whatever it is that at the moment seems hard and maybe you don't want to do is probably the right decision and the thing that you need to go through and do. So I think you've got for some people, and I might lump myself in this, sitting down and just grinding and working harder and kind of running through the wall instead of maybe taking a step back to be a little introspective and look around and see if maybe there's a window or door to the side you could go through. We just smash through the wall. I think for other people, uh, you know, inaction and thoughtfulness is their default, and sometimes those people do need to just smash through the wall. So, it's for me, it's kind of, I think you had a few guests ago, someone, Kevin, I think Barnacle, and he had this notion of like do the opposite. And that's actually, and he was a lot more eloquent than I was about it or than I am about it. But I think there's this notion of, it's a little bit contrarian or put yourself on the other side of the table. Or, if, I mean, his was more about the marketplace, I think. But for me, it's kind of internal where if you really want to go right, you should strongly consider maybe going left at this time. It's great to take advantages of your strength, but I think we all do that naturally. So pulling away from that and fixing other deficits and holes and maybe just doing what it is you don't want to do at that moment.
I think there's a lot in what you said, and you said it this way: everything you want is on the other side of something you don't want to do, and I think that what you're saying. also, and the next part of that was we have to challenge our normal approach about that, right? So if you're a contemplative person, that may mean instead of contemplating, you need to go to action. If you're an action-oriented person, maybe you don't want to just smash through the door. Maybe you need to think about it, right? Is that what you're saying? You're sort of almost bringing Kevin's idea of do the opposite, but do the opposite of what you usually do in order to get to something.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's it's funny. So at the last company I was at, we it was called Arrive Hotels, and I was a bit younger then, both emotionally and age wise. And so we had a very strong sort of like Jocko Willing culture, which was just like get after it and just go. And you know but it was a boutique hotel company, so you're not just hiring those people, right? You have to be great with guests, and there's a lot of empathy, and you need a high EQ folks, and you need a really nice diverse team of people and thinkers who can approach and solve problems in different ways. And at the same time, though, I'd been listening to and reading Seth Godin for a really long time, and so my very like rudimentary way of approaching this was the folks who are all in on Jocko need to read some Seth Godin, and maybe some like Brene Brown. And the folks who are on that side maybe need a little bit more like just Jocko Willink, like stop being contemplative to use your words and just really, dive in and take action. And I think there's a lot more sort of nuance to it. And there's, I think on every kind of attribute and aspect of like your life and work life, there's a balance or there's a spectrum, and you can be on either side of it. And but it was just something that kind of struck me was we had this sort of just the people who would just run through the wall, and it's like, hey, slow down, let's maybe work on nobody's impugning your work ethic, we don't need to lean into that, like maybe we sort of focus on being more contemplative and figuring out if there's maybe a smarter way to get things done or a gentler way that will appeal to the team, to the guests, could help with the business, and vice versa. So it's been this kind of evolving thing where it took me a handful of years to really realize, and for myself too, you know the mistake a lot of the mistakes I've made and a lot of the failures and misses I've had are because I just kept doing exactly what had gotten me results. But there's this great book, what got you here won't get you there, and you sort of think about that, and it's like, okay, if we want to advance and we want to progress and proceed through life and do better and better and better, at some level the next step up always requires a different set of skills.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and there's a lot there. And one of the things I want to say is, you said it in what you shared. There was a lot of recognition, and you did bring up, Goldsmith's book, right? It was a brilliant book about what brought you here isn't going to take you there. The brilliance of all of this is, even in your own story, you're sharing that the things that you use to get to those previous roles or those previous opportunities aren't going to create the future. And one of the ideas that we talk about here often is this idea of a future how. You need to be focused on where you want to go to invent the way you're going to do it, because the way you're going to do it can't be just leaning backward, because if you're leaning backward, you're going to fall backward. But you have because what you did to get where you are, well, you figured that part out. You're here. But that's not what's going to take you there. So you've got to align to where you are, focus on what you want, and take the next step. Invent that future how. And doing the thing really gets you focused on that. But you're not saying do the thing randomly. You're saying do the thing, but focus on what you want. Focus on where you're going, right? So you admitted that you've experimented with this and it didn't work out. So let's talk about the story. Let's talk about the career story. You've been in the the hospitality industry, the hotel business for a little while. Let's talk about that journey and how you learned this lesson.
Sure. So, I mean, I started washing dishes when I was 13. It was a summer job, and
And that wasn't like your mom and dad told you to wash dishes. You're doing as a job washing dishes.
yeah, it was funny actually. I had a friend who, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and there's this small lake, and we had an apartment there for the summer, and 12, 13, you start getting kind of like odd jobs. And I had a friend who got this job washing dishes at what, later I would come to know as a pretty terrible restaurant, but at the time it seemed great. And one day he called me, and I'd heard about his job and it was fun. And, like they're getting free burgers and like they're able to eat and like screw around. And I was like, well, this sounds great. And one day he calls me, he's like, hey, I'm sick. Can you cover my shift for me? And thinking about it today, like, I don't know what I would do if just, I had one person hired and just their buddy showed up for a shift. But, without dating myself back then, like I just showed up for the shift and it was totally okay. And I loved it. So then I got hired as a dishwasher, and it was, it's certainly not the hardest job in the world, but it's also definitely not the easiest one. I mean, it's dirty, it's steamy, it's sweaty, it's can be gross, but there's a lot of camaraderie. And, I finished out my summer as a dishwasher. The next year I went back and I was a dishwasher, and I really wanted to be like a prep cook and work my way kind of up the hierarchy. And I started doing that. And, I got into cooking, and I thought I was going to be a chef, or I wanted to be a chef. I worked at a great restaurant in Buffalo, which, a James Beard Award winning chef had come back to Buffalo to take it over because his mother was sick. So he sort of moved the family to Buffalo. And I learned a ton about cooking and food there. And it was really interesting, though. Around the time I went to college, Anthony Bourdain's first book, Kitchen Confidential, came out.
Mm.
And that was a very, I mean, I am sort of a type A kind of aggressive person. And kitchens were, I mean, Buffalo was certainly not Manhattan, but kind of like that, whereas hard charging, high energy, um, you know, not necessarily the most professional place. And so Kitchen Confidential kind of, one, none of it surprised me, but two, it basically, like, getting into college and cooking through college, it really reinforced my belief that, like, this is what it's supposed to be, no compromise, just you see the problem, you run at the problem. And that was really an approach I took through college. When I graduated, I shifted into the front of house. I moved to Las Vegas, and my mentors there were very much the same way, which was, it was just this absolutely, and I don't necessarily mean, I mean, to some degree maybe toxic, but that's how it was back then. But it was this very relentless approach to work, right? I mean, you got after it, and you just ran at it, and you didn't compromise, and you didn't accept failure. And you just you just left it all out there every day, all the time. And it was very kind of hard charging, and not that there's anything wrong with that. And then through my career, as I kind of evolved, um, I ended up, a few things happened, like food and beverage. Like when we opened up my first restaurant, I had this partner who had been a pastry chef at Alinea. And, that was also, I think, I've never worked at a restaurant of that caliber, but, talking to him, and we ran in a reasonably small circle, an incredibly hard restaurant to work at for all the same reasons: relentless, no acceptance of failure. But the thing that started being different was, it was certainly much more professional, and restaurants had become much more professional and technical than sort of that Kitchen Confidential world. Nobody was swearing, nobody's throwing things. It's very quiet. It's almost silent, minus people calling in an order and repeating it back. And so my shifting, my thinking started, I think, without realizing it, my thinking began to change, where it's like, oh, there's another level to the game. I've never operated at that level, but I really like the output when I eat at these restaurants. Um, all the chefs and people I'm surrounded with in my career who've worked in these environments, and I respect tremendously, and I wish I could be, half as talented as they are in my respective field, sort of came from it. So you begin realizing, like, oh, there's a few different ways, but everyone is still absolutely relentless. Um, you know, from Los Angeles, where I had a restaurant, sort of opened a second, sold the first one, opened a third, that crashed and burned. I'd always been in and around big hotels. I ended up working for Kimpton Hotels for a minute. And then I got recruited to come to Arrive to be the COO and partner. And we grew this hotel brand from one to five, with a few in the pipeline, and sold it at the end of 2020. And that was, at some point in that part of my career, it's when I began to realize, because we had multiple properties, and I was still very relentless. So I began to realize, I think, and apply it to other people, which was, if you're this idea of like, if you're one way, build the skill set, go the other way, right? Don't abandon everything that got you here, but leverage that ability and aptitude and apply it differently to become more well-rounded. Sadly, I never applied it to myself. And then we sold, and I was taking some time off, and I really, as I started with Ofland, which at the time was called Yonder, I really began to realize, because of the nature of the business, and I think just kind of where I was in life, and hospitality is, always been in an interesting place, but was in a really interesting place in like late 20, call it like 2021, where it was still kind of this like pandemic-ish era, but coming out of it. And I think people were hungry to get out of it. But all of the impacts of COVID had, economically and socially and with travel, had were still, had yet to be felt, but were completely right. Like, but we were sort of in this bizarre time where things were, you knew they were going to change, and they were changing, and nobody knew what was going to stick and what wasn't going to stick. So you just had to be extremely flexible. And that was the moment where I realized, like, I really need to, I could do the same thing I've always been doing, and I don't know that I'll get better results. I really need to take a better approach. And I need to sort of like look at myself and figure out, I have always been going, in this direction hard, and maybe there's another way if I sort of pull back, which I don't want to do, and I don't want to relinquish control and autonomy and all these things. And it started, as I started doing that, I sort of applied it to the rest of my life, which was whatever in the moment I don't want to do, because it's going to be maybe not physically difficult for me, but like just difficult to let go, or difficult to slow down, or difficult to stop and think instead of jumping into action. And as I started doing that, I just started getting kind of better results. And I noticed I was also like a lot happier when I really started, diving into that, and kind of accepting it in life. Sorry, that was really long winded.
No, there's a lot there. Um, I think that's amazing. One of the things that I noticed in the way you told your story, you talked about the restaurants and how they evolved. Then you talked about how, you know, the hotel industry evolved up to 2020, of course, COVID year, and then following. And each time you're talking about these pivots, what I noticed about each one of them is that you approach it with a great deal of curiosity. Is that something learned, or is that something that you've always had? Have you always had that, "Hey, what's on the other side of this? What's the other opportunity? What's the other piece?" And how do you de-risk that in a business that you increasingly know very well? Like, you've been in hotels for a while now. You understand that business very well. You've gone from you've built one organization, and you're doing it again with Upland. And what does that look like? How do you get to that curious place?
I think I've always been naturally very curious, probably to a detriment. I mean, I think if you asked my mom or my brother, like, there was a point where, I cut an electrical cord and for fun, and plugged it in the socket to see what would happen. So that was, I think there's some upside and some downside to that. Um, you know, I don't know that I ever thought about really de-risking it. I think I've slowed down on some of the curiosity as far as it goes to risk taking. But really, that is one, I think, as I've aged, what is fun and you accept it, in your 20s, is very different than your 30s, than your 40s. And the thing I've kind of boiled it all down to, at least specifically for me, is we want to make people happy. I mean, we're in hospitality, and Upland is an outdoor boutique hotel company, and that's sort of to some degree a great place to be for that, because even if you're in boutique hotels in business, right? I mean, business travelers are not always, or necessarily, the happiest people. They're going to a city for work. But at the point where you're taking time off and sort of getting to the outdoors, and you're taking a long drive to get there, like, you're there to have a good time, and it's our job to make you happy. And so I think curiosity, in terms of iteration and trying new things, once you've sort of figured out that the goal, and this is, another one, right? My goal is always to sort of be the best, And I didn't quantify that really well. And it was really the best from my view. And the thing I abandoned is it doesn't really matter what I think. I might be in the demographic and the psychographic for a product we're putting out, but what I almost know too much, right? What I consider the best is, one, maybe not in line at all with what people want, but what's more likely is sort of that 80-20 rule, where that last 20% that I care, Pat, that I think is really neat and I'm curious about, frequently doesn't show a lot of return to most people, right? I mean, we all use 20% of a product, but it's sort of a different 20%. And so I really look at it like the curiosity in terms of how to make people happy is useful. And I think to answer your question, that's kind of how I've de-risked it or harnessed it. Like, what is the best way to make people happy? But it's 10 years ago, it was, what's something new we can do, period, full stop, right? And like, maybe and it should obviously make things like better, but technically better, and what people want better, and which leads to them being happy or not happy, are really different things. And so I've
Mhm.
just really like simplified. It's like, it's not about what I want to do. It's not about awards and accolades. It's, let's make people happy. And we think about that very holistically, right? I mean, that includes everything on the guest journey. It includes the value proposition, which is a huge thing, right? Like, I could put $100 in every hotel room, but like every time someone checks in, and I think they would be happy, but one, probably our investors wouldn't be happy, or I'd have to pass that cost on to the guest, and ultimately they wouldn't. So it's really about like holistically thinking about, how do we make sure that everyone's happier when they leave than when they arrived, or when they have fond memories of us when they think about us. And I think that's been a good. I mean, that's been another one of those turning things where I was just so focused on technical aspects in terms of a measure of quality, instead of like, what is the human who's actually experiencing this? How do they feel about
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the things that I think that's also um, interesting about your approach is finding this, idea of getting through the other level, or through this relentless approach, but relentless approach of finding the uncomfortable path, the less worn path. And one of the ideas again that we explore here often is this idea that growth is often uncomfortable. Growth is if you're finding the and it's ironic, right? You've got this beautiful outdoor boutique hotel, and when I saw images of it, is these it's glamping on steroids, right? It's just absolutely gorgeous, beautiful outdoor cabins and campgrounds, but it's vintage airstreams and all kinds of really cool stuff in the desert. So you've got this really beautiful glamping experience, but what you're creating for people is this. In order to get there, you took an uncomfortable approach to get there, right? You're finding this growth in an uncomfortable way, and I think that's really interesting. In order to do that, you've got to make sure your buckets are full, right? You have to make sure that your energy is in the right place, that you're not dealing from a place of scarcity. And I think that you've hinted at this a lot. You talked about reading Bourdain, you talked about Goldsmith, you talked about Seth, you talked about, you know, a lot of thought leaders that you've devoured along the way. Is this how you make sure that you've got your buckets full? Is this what you do to center yourself before thinking about how to get to where you want?
Yes, I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts because, a lot of flight time and a lot of drive time sort of gives you the ability to do a lot of listening and introspection. I think over the last few years, you know, fewer podcasts. Like, I don't devour quite as much. There's sort of other activities in life, I think, that sort of help me be centered. Like, one thing I know, I mean, I sort of have two physical activities that do the same but in different directions. One thing I noticed is, like, I love swimming laps, and I can sort of jump into the pool and have a bunch of problems to solve. And I, not necessarily sort of alternate between focusing on technique and thinking about problems. And somehow, when I by the end of my swim, and I can never pinpoint when it happens, and I'll sort of try to, and like, you just lose it. But I've kind of got the solution to a lot of the problems, right? I've been able to think through it both consciously and unconsciously. And I do jujitsu, which is kind of the opposite, which is you step on the mat and just nothing matters, right? Everything else in your life for that one period of time, and maybe in the first 5 minutes of class, I'll be thinking about something at work or something in my personal life or whatever it is. And I don't remember when it leaves me, but all the problems are gone, and somehow I wake up the next day or after class, eat something, take a shower, and I've got solutions to the problem. And I think it's because you're so disconnected, your mind works on other things consciously. You're dealing with the problem of like, how do I do these physical movements? How do I prevent this guy who wants to kill me in the moment from killing me?
That's
And
right.
subconsciously, everything just kind of clicks. Because at some point, like there's a pretty finite number of podcasts and podcast guests. So even when you love something for a period of time, episode 180 and 300, if you've listened to all of them, like it's not that it doesn't provide returns, but they're diminishing returns, right? You've heard similar things, or you've seen the same guest on 10 or 15 episodes of different podcasts, or you've read the books and you've read the sequel and now you're on their third book. And so at some point I think like I've just let myself also process and think about it. So I think it's a real balance.
Yeah, and I think that's where it comes to doing the thing, right? I think that also going back to your napkin, you can sit around and think about things all day long, but action, having a bias to action, no results. You have to have action, and I love the contrast of swimming laps versus finding yourself on the mat. When you find yourself on the mat in jujitsu, you've got to be focused on what's happening there because if you're not, you'll end up on the mat, and that doesn't always feel great. Swimming laps is a little more forgiving because no one's looking for you to stop paying attention.
Right. Exactly.
You're against yourself in that
Yeah.
environment. In jujitsu, you've got a very clear and present opponent that you have to manage. So it's interesting that you've got those two different pursuits that you use to bring yourself back into focus, right?
Yeah, I think that contrast is, it's just, I mean, sometimes you need to think about problems to solve them, and sometimes you need to take time away from problems to solve them. And inevitably, I think that's kind of it's like that bias to action, which is, you know, I'm at the computer and I'm in my head and I'm like working, and it's like, okay, I got to stop, right? I need to get away from this, even though maybe I'm in a decent flow state and you shouldn't interrupt that, or I can't solve the problem. And just stressing about it at some point, like, former me would just sit there and kind of, you burn yourself out, and you just don't progress. And I don't want to say this new enlightened version, but, maybe a little less Neanderthalic me realizes like, the brain can keep working on things even when I'm not thinking about it. Like, let me actually stop, and it might add some stress to my plate later or tomorrow, but let me get out and do something different that can really, allow me to open my mind and really, synthesize the solutions to these problems.
So let's talk about some of these problems because I think so. To me, looking at from the outside, so you started in restaurants in Buffalo, so you're an honorary Canadian, so that's why we get along so
Pretty
well
close.
already. So, so you started there, and then moved to Vegas, and stayed in restaurants, which is of a certain pace. Then did your stuff in Los Angeles, built and sold and exited successfully and unsuccessfully a couple restaurants, and then went into hospitality via the hotel industry. And it was originally like regular hotels, and now you've got this glamping package in 250 miles from everywhere, and that's a different business. Like that's a really different model than what you've been doing. And there's a whole bunch of different problems to solve and challenges and opportunities in that. You have to come at it with a different approach. And I really do love the name. And you corrected me. I said offland and me at the beginning, but you said it's of land. And looking at the property, it's incredible, right? How integrated it is with the land around you, how beautiful it is. Its location in nature is incredible, and it's a part of nature that a lot of people don't know. Desert living is a little bit different than everywhere else, so it's an incredible experience, I'm sure. but what are some of the like the that must have been a total shift in thinking.
Yes and no. I mean, so I think, and that's one of the aspects of it, right? So I think you're looking for the thing I realized, and if I went back and did any prior project I've done before up until now, my approach would be fairly different. So I think when we approached this, and it was kind of interesting. So, when I was talking to, my partner and the CEO of sort of one of the other founders at the time, and the question you get asked, because from people who haven't operated hotels or restaurants, when you do it, you get asked a lot of technical questions, right? When you're sort of talking to them, if you have experience, what point of sales do you use? What software to manage the hotel, right? I mean, because those are the things that, everyone's very focused on the fun part of the product, right? Like everyone wants to pick the spoons that go on the table, right? I mean, and so they think the rest of it's just this technical aspect. And at the time, I didn't know any better. So you answer the questions and you're like, hey, this isn't the hard part. I think what this has really taught me, though, is like, you just got to make people happy, right? And because there's so much we can't do being in the middle of nowhere, um, but also because being in the middle of nowhere provides, right? I mean, like Mother Nature has built our product for us. It's our job to not screw it up, right? I always make, the steakhouse analogy, which is like our site, our location, and the beauty of that's the steak on the plate, right? Like we just need to not over garnish it. We need to make sure that like it gets to the table hot and it works. But it's not about throwing a bunch of stuff on top. And really, it's fundamentally, it's our job to make people happy. And this has really, I think, clarified that for me. And there's you can do so much less than you think. What you really need are some great people who are really friendly and empathetic and attentive. And you don't need a lot of the technical things to work. You can sort of really use like hospitality and genuine connection to get that result. Um, and this has really shown me that. So I think I wouldn't say like I'm solving a totally different problem. I think what this has done is it's really distilled my thinking, which
I really
is
like
you just
that.
need to make people happy.
Yeah, you keep on coming back to that. It might have been napkin part 2, right? Like,
Yeah,
just
just
make
make
people
people
happy.
happy.
Do the
Actually, that would be a
thing,
much
and the
better nap.
thing is just make people happy. I had this thought that I riffed on at a recent Edge of the Napkin episode, and the Edge of the Napkin episode is hype versus value. And value is always about contribution. Value is always about connection. Value is always about people. Value is always rooted in the customer, in your partners, and organizations, companies that get this really right are magnets for success because suppliers want to do business with them. Customers want to be there. Employees want to be there. Everybody wants to be around these people because they're creating value. They're really doing that. And I love what else you said about that is doing a lot less than I thought was necessary. And I think that's really important because growth is about subtraction. It's not about what more can I do, how much more can I throw on top of the steak, like you said. It's how do I keep it simple? How do I bring out what is already naturally there? And I think it was somewhere on your website. You said something like, "Don't mind getting a little sand in your ears. Here's something
Right.
for you." Like it's just brilliant that you've captured that idea because unless you're in that environment, you don't know that you get sand in your ears, right? You don't
Right.
know that that's what happens. It's really cool, right?
Yeah, and thanks for noticing that because we spend a lot of time on word choice and you know when to have fewer words, which is something we're really focused on these days, especially with this product, because it's just so visual. But yeah, I mean, I think you really nailed it. It's inch wide, mile deep, right? I mean, that's the nature of it. It's not. Yeah, and I think one of the interpretations, especially when you deal with at quote scale and institutional money, they look at it and they're like, this is a great line of business to be in. We can just do less. It's like you can do fewer things, but you're not doing less. You're just really, really, really focused. And in some ways, it's harder and more intensive to do those things better, right? And so I think for some people, it's everyone loves doing a lot of things a little bit. I mean, I think that's really natural, right? Like you can sort of have the surface area of things and really enjoy all of those different aspects, but it's maybe more toilets to clean, or everyone wants games on the patio at whatever hotel or restaurant. It's like you got to pick up every one of those chess pieces or connect four pieces, or every Uno card, and you got to make sure the decks are right. It's like the idea that sort of right, like you can do a million things, but really doing them well and making sure they all work is hard. Um, and so I totally agree, but it's what we do looks very simple. It's not a lot of, I think it's simple but not easy is the way I'd express it. And
Yeah.
so and that's been the trade-off, because for a lot of people, for myself included, it can be a lot less fun just really focusing on word choice or nailing this one sliver of what you do, but taking it all the way to completion, instead of doing one thing that looks fun, moving on to the next, moving on to the next, but never, a lot of things at like a C- level for us in the space we're in. But I think in life, I would have done better had I really just done less, but really, really, really drilled down.
Really like the distinction between it's yeah, you can do fewer things, but you can't do less. You can do fewer things, but you have to do them better. You
Yeah,
don't right? It's not
yeah, yeah. I mean, like, it's like what you said, right? Like, it's value. So the value is some combination of the number of things times how well you do them. So you can't, you know, and to me, how well things are executed, and I have to make sure that's not just my predilection, but I've over time, I really think that's important to people. I think the level of execution far outweighs the number of things. Now, we live in a world where the number of activities and things you can express really well on social media and online, and it looks great. But when the rubber meets the road and the people experience this stuff, to me, I think, if it's like, it's not quantity times quality equals value. To me, it's like quantity times quality squared equals value. Right? I think like it's like that much more important.
yeah, that's a really important distinction. Um, make people happy. That's a very powerful lagging indicator. Like you need to do the thing and then see that they're happy. How do you how do you test that what you're going to do is going to make people happy? How do you test that new idea or the new service or the new whatever? How do you vet that?
We so I I look at the so I don't love necessarily sort of focus groups and surveys and things. I think they have their place, but people don't necessarily, one, either know what they want, or they're thinking about it kind of in a vacuum. So for me, especially when we launch something or when we start, and unfortunately, as we've gotten busier and are working on new projects, I get less of this time, but I make sure everyone kind of thinks about it. Is I sort of watch the body language. Like, if you put something on the menu, you're seeing a food and beverage works, walking over and asking people how they enjoy it, that's not a bad tool. A survey after the fact isn't a bad tool at all, but you watch their body language. Like, if someone eats something delicious, and really what you're playing against when you're talking about making people happy is like expectation. So we just sort of like look at food and beverage because it's kind of this instant thing. If if they take a bite of something and they love it, you watch, like, and you can see from 10 or 15 feet away, especially if you've been working like in restaurants for a while, like their shoulders slump a little. They have this, like, they let out like this almost inaudible sigh. They smile, their eyes widen, and like, okay, that bite of something really, really like hit them in a way that they might not even be able to speak about, right? And so you could put together a survey, but in the moment, we know we're winning that. Or they walk into check in and they're greeted, and you can see maybe they're a little bit tired or stressed from the drive, and they're greeted positively. And their kids run outside, or their travel partner, or even like they get outside and see an aspect or a thing we do. And you can just see in their body language, like, this is making them happy, we're winning. And to me, I think what's unsaid is absolutely critical. And I don't know that there's a great way to measure that without, one, being empathetic and having taken the time in your career to like develop your ability to read people, and two, putting yourself physically in that place where you can see it, right? I mean, all I think everyone would love to lean on like technology and surveys and focus groups, but I don't think that I don't think that would tell the story in exactly the same way. And you've also got to sort of be around to understand, like, if we do something, like if we implement something or we try something out and it doesn't hit, then there's this other important question, which is our idea bad or is our execution bad? Right. And I think you've got to just kind of know your space and understand your product to be able to very quickly, like, I mean, I use food as just a good example because rooms are a little more challenging, where you obviously aren't with the guest when they check into their room. Like, you have to gauge their reaction around property, but you don't necessarily see their immediate reactions to things. But food and beverage is so instantaneous. Like, when you've been around it enough, you can sort of like look at and smell the food as it's coming out, or in the area. And I know, like, if that burger or those fries are undercooked, overcooked, whatever, and somebody takes a bite and they're not happy, that doesn't mean we've got the wrong menu item, right? That just means, like, we didn't execute it to the right level. And so I always have this conversation with people, which is like, because everyone in our industry, not everyone, a lot of people, we all compare ourselves to other places. And so, we'll go to, like, sometimes you go to a hotel or restaurant, whatever, and you kind of want it to be, maybe you don't want it to be bad, but you want to feel good about yourself. And a lot of times, like, we all miss on experiences. And so my question is, like, does it suck then, or did it suck that one time? And those are really different things. And so to answer your question, like, you've just got to be in it to understand, is it hitting or not? And if not, why isn't it hitting? Right? Like, are we not delivering what we promised, or is what we're promising just not making people happy? And then you kind of keep going down the decision tree and working on it and cleaning up, and you get to the right place. I don't know that there's, as with everything else, right? Like, sometimes you got to just do the thing. Like, you got to be there. It would be way easier to install some software and just get a result. But I think being there and engaging with people, both verbally and non-verbally, is just so, so, so critical to what we do.
It's really funny when as you were talking, I had written down, be present, be there. And you said that. And part of doing the thing is, there's no substitution for looking your customer in the eye. There's no substitution. And we know when we're looking someone in the eye, if what we've given them has been good or not. And we can see that because they appreciate it. And I think that's a beautiful way to segue into how we close our episodes. Um, uh, 11 years ago, John Rulin, a great friend of the show, gave us a napkin that said, "What you appreciate appreciates." And his idea is that when you appreciate someone, or when you appreciate a client or a customer or an employee or whatever the case might be, they appreciate and value. They light up, and they light up people around them too. And that is a great gift to give. And he would always start with that. And he created a movement around it. Suddenly passed away last year, and uh, as a shout out to him, as a we continue to pay forward his movement of gratitude, and we ask our guests to shout out someone and lay some appreciation on someone around them. Who would you like to shout out today, Noah?
I think for me, I worked with, when I joined the Mina Group under Michael Mina. We had just hired a corporate pastry chef and we were based in the same restaurant which was opening, and his name was Lincoln Carson, and he's a little bit older than me, but certainly much more mature, much more talented, much wiser. And I was, young and a punk, which I kind of still am a punk today. But he really, I think, to some degree, appreciated me. And I didn't report into him. I mean, he was certainly well above me in the hierarchy, but he, I think, appreciated me. And really, I don't know if it was intentional, but he very much mentored me. And he was a very, I was loud and rambunctious and sort of moving around at high speed. And he was incredibly talented, but almost like ninja like, very, very precise, not a wasted motion, a man of few words, but each one counted. And being around him, and he wasn't beating me up, but just being around him, he set such a great example. And as we did all these restaurant openings and we became good friends, and we're still very close to this day, it was just such a positive influence on me. professionally, and then that sort of leaks into the rest of your life, where, I went from being, I think, I think at the time I was talented and able to achieve, but kind of like a hot mess, to a little bit of a professional. And it certainly wasn't instantaneous, and I'm still working on it. But he was just such an incredible influence and supportive. And I think unknowingly, he really mentored me and set such a great example for me that I still, take his lessons to this day.
That's amazing. Thanks for that, Noah. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Noah, thank you. What a powerful conversation, and what a reminder that the work that matters, the work that creates real value, isn't loud, complicated, or scattered. It's focused, present, intentional. It's the courage to do the thing, even when it's not glamorous, and even when, maybe especially when, nobody's watching. Today, you helped us see that excellence comes from being there, really there, watching the body language, noticing the unsaid, reading the reactions that data can't capture, and choosing fewer things done better instead of more things done poorly. Those insights are going to resonate for a long time. And here are the key takeaways we explored today. Do fewer things, but do them better. Simplicity doesn't mean ease, it means discipline. Execution outranks variety. People remember how well you delivered, not how many options you offered. Presence reveals the truth. Real feedback lives in body language, emotions, and the moments in between words. Bad outcomes aren't always bad ideas. Sometimes the idea is right, it's just needing better execution. Value is created in the doing. You can't outsource awareness, empathy, or excellence. And as always, to everyone listening, maybe there's someone whose influence helped you move from chaos to clarity. Tell them, share this episode with them. And if this episode sparked something in you, maybe a decision, maybe a question, maybe a quiet nudge, I'd love to hear what doing the thing means to you right now. Share it with us at the hashtag Paper Napkin Wisdom, or jot it down on a napkin and keep it close to you. And most importantly, share this episode and message with someone who needs it. Remember, insight matters, but action multiplies it. Until next time, go do the thing and make it a great day.